Welcome back to the Afternoon Agenda on GB News with me, Alex Phillips. Let's continue our conversation now on gender identity. I'm asking you, does it have too much influence? Let's focus now on gender dysphoria. That's when someone experiences discomfort or distress because their gender identity is different from their biological sex. It can start from a very young age and can hugely impact young people. In 2018 to 2019, Childline had 996 counselling sessions about gender dysphoria, with many children anxious about their feelings. Well, let's speak to Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist and founder of Genspect, a support network for parents with gender-questioning kids. Stella, thank you so much for coming on. First of all, what is the incidence of gender dysphoria at present among young people? Is that going up or is it relatively steady, do you think?
Well, yeah, it's going up very fast. Officially, kind of back in the day in the literature, it was 1 in every 10,000 for males and 1 in every 30,000 for females. And that kind of consistently stayed for a long time. And it's dramatically shifted in the last 10 years. And suddenly there's been an extraordinary spike in the numbers. For example, in the Tavistock in the UK, the UK's largest NHS gender clinic, the rises have been 4,000 to 5,000% rises for adolescent girls presenting with gender dysphoria. Now, they've never been seen before in the medical literature because never before were adolescent girls seeking to medically transition. It was generally seen among young boys and middle-aged men. And so this whole new cohort has disrupted all the stats, all the figures, all the kind of curve is completely distorted. And nobody seems to know why, as suddenly a new cohort has erupted. And with gender dysphoria. And it's not only girls, the teenage boys seem to be following suit and following that curve. And nobody has really penetrated why, other than it seems to be in the news an awful lot. And there's an awful lot more role models. And it's certainly a better place now to live as a transgender person, so it might be a lot easier. So there's a few reasons you could say, and it still doesn't account for 4,000 to 5,000% rise.
Do you think that there's a degree here of people being subconsciously or maybe very consciously influenced by what is, because of the prominence and the high-profile nature of the trans activists campaign, and now seeing more than ever people like, I forget the name of Jenna, who was on the front of Time magazine. Sorry, it'll come back to me, it's a Friday. But did you think that there's
It's Caitlyn Jenner.
Caitlyn, yes, thank you. I was groping around in the back of my brain for that and it just wouldn't come. But do you think that actually the prominence of this campaign is giving it a sort of almost trendy vibe, and that to feel like they need to fit in with a progressive society, teenagers are adopting pronouns and playing with gender, but perhaps this is now going too far and having a sort of psychosomatic effect?
I think that could be one of the reasons. I think it's very likely to be one of the reasons, but it's not only the reason. There's definitely a concept that was never in the mainstream before, that there was such a concept as gender and you could become a different person. And that if you took this medication, you could leave your identity behind. You could start with a new name. You could delete all references to your old name and you would then become a new person. That concept wasn't in the mainstream because it's a fairly outlandish idea that you can become a different person, because you can never become a different person. You're stuck with who you are. And this concept of gender identity, you can put on new gender identity and that will be you, has been lifted, and adolescents are flocking to this concept because they find it incredibly attractive and luring. Why? Because they're incredibly unhappy, because an awful lot of adolescents are unhappy with their body. An awful lot of adolescents feel very uncomfortable with their growing sexuality and their growing development of their kind of sexual characteristics, such as their breasts and their hair. And so while I think there might be some kind of level of it's cool, it's edgy, it's certainly celebrated to be trans, and I'm glad it is in its own way, it's definitely become an alluring concept that I can be somebody else. And that's why simplifying it to you can be somebody else, and concepts like dead naming, it doesn't help. It doesn't help vulnerable kids. It doesn't help naive kids who don't know better and who don't realize you can never get away from who you are. You're stuck with who you are. And the most productive and helpful thing for anybody who hates themselves is to be kind of taught or helped to kind of like themselves on some level. And I'm not saying that everybody shouldn't transition. If people want to transition, certainly they should, but they shouldn't do it as a child. And in Genspect, we kind of were created, like we must have 13 or 14 countries, loads and loads of parents' organisations. We've all kind of allied together to form Genspect. And the idea is all these parents are saying the same thing. They're all saying, I've got naive, vulnerable kid, very often with a mental health issue, often with autism or ADHD, and they think they can be somebody else. And they think that because of gender identity. And they've kind of fallen into this idea that they can leave behind their old self and become a new self, and nobody will ever talk about the old self again. And that's not fair on vulnerable kids.
Yeah, do you know, on that point, actually, I'd like to read out an email we've had from a viewer already, and they want to remain anonymous. They said, my story is that I was unaware of any of this until the day my daughter came home for the afternoon to tell me that her teenage brother was now also my daughter. He's undoubtedly on the spectrum. He didn't fit in with the norm at school. He played online a lot rather than go out with friends, and I believe he was groomed online. Then, our second son told us he too was a woman. As I stand my ground and refuse to cheer them on, my relationship with my children is now in tatters. I'm so frightened for my sons if they go down the route of surgery. I cannot believe 3 intelligent children have been so brainwashed. Do you think, I mean, that's clearly a parent who's had 2 children now, one who she says is on the spectrum, 2 boys have turned around and said, we both believe we are women. She is finding that hard to accept. It doesn't seem to be from a position of intolerance, but fear. Do you think that's quite a common reaction for parents?
It's by far and away the most common reaction. These parents that come to us, the parents in Genspect, they are progressive, they're very accepting, they're very tolerant, and they always say, if I thought that medical transition was the best route for them, I would help them on their way. The fact is, I think that they're distressed. I think that their autism is getting in the way. I think that they're naive and they actually think they can become somebody different, and that doesn't help them. And also, I think that they have become kind of influenced by social peers. For example, siblings coming out as trans isn't as unusual as you might think. Because when one person does it, somebody else goes, wow, that's amazing. Wow. And the stats bear me up on this. And Lisa Littman did an extraordinary study of parents who had children with gender dysphoria and who sought medical transition. And what she found was that when you had somebody in the peer group who was seeking to medically transition, then it was like 50 times more likely, 50 to 70 times if I have the numbers right, that somebody else would. So it's phenomenal level of influences happening within peer groups. And I really want to emphasize there's a certain type of person. They're quirky, they're shy, they're socially awkward, they're highly intelligent, they're cerebral, they're a little bit out of touch with their body. And they are that particular personality type is really, really common in that adolescent cohort that we know so little about. And those kids, I would say, are naive and vulnerable, and they need that little bit more attention. And they don't need to be fast-tracked. And so many parents are saying, honestly, if we could just slow down, think about it, make sure that the child is getting all the services that they need, and then we can slowly go towards something. It's the speed and the kind of certainty that somebody that within days can go from being I'm a girl to I'm a boy, change my name, change the uniform I wear, change the changing rooms that I go into, the toilets I go into, change everything. And the schools are going with this because they're being given the guidance that this is appropriate. It's not working out. The families are incredibly unhappy. We're representing more than thousands of parents who are all saying the same thing. They're all saying it's going too fast and it's too medicalised. And why can't these kids just be gender non-conforming? Why can't, boys wear dresses?
Yeah, well, quite. I couldn't agree with you more. And there are lots of stories out there that totally back up what you have to say. Thank you so much for coming on, Stella, and talking us through the psychological aspects of all of this. That's Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist and founder of Genspect.